They slaughtered humanity's ambassadors and laughed. The Dreadnought that answered carried no flag. The first shot didn't echo. The thing he would remember was the silence that followed the first trigger pull inside the Vithara ratification chamber, because the room was acoustically sealed for diplomatic precision, and the sound simply stopped at the walls. That was the thing Veth Soren would remember for the rest of his career. Not the 14 bodies, not the broadcast, not the Supreme Legate's voice filling the relay. And the guard moved to the next ambassador without pausing, and the whole process felt, in that terrible sealed quiet, like paperwork. The 14 human diplomats stood in a single row. They had been arranged by height. Someone had done that, deliberately arranged them by height as if for a photograph. The tallest was a woman named Ose. She was at the left end of the row, and she was looking straight ahead when the guard reached her. And she did not close her eyes. Supreme Legate Drevath Orn was not watching. He was at the far end of the chamber, adjusting the fold of his collar, the formal gray of the Compact's senior administration, 3 horizontal bands that denoted his tier, pressing it flat with 2 fingers while the process continued behind him. He did not turn around until the 14th shot. Then he straightened his cuffs, crossed the polished floor, and stepped to the station podium without haste. He opened the relay himself. 40 sovereign species received the feed simultaneously. Orn waited 6 seconds for the connection to stabilize across the full network, the way a senior administrator waits for a document to finish printing. Then he spoke. "Let the record show." He said that they came with words. "We answered with the only language that matters." They did not fight back. He paused. "That tells you everything you need to know about them." He left the channel active for 6 hours. "Stay close. What comes after the silence is the part that still doesn't make sense to me." 9 years earlier, or rather 9 years before the day, Drevath Orn filed the execution footage under pre-martial species management and closed his daily schedule. Earth received its first formal contact from the Vourkai Compact. The contact was not a greeting. The Compact maintained a running catalog of every species in its administered territory, ranked by technological capability, resource utility, and what their internal doctrine called Martial Potential Index, a score derived from observed fleet tonnage. It was a tier assignment, weapons-grade material production, and what the ranking analyst noted in the margin of Earth's file as behavioral ceiling indicators. The margin note on humanity's file, translated from the Compact's administrative Vorlang, read, "Low aggression social structure, no organized extrasolar military projection. Recommends standard integration track, labor and raw material extraction." Tier 6. Tier 6 was 3 levels below the threshold at which a species was consulted before territorial decisions were made about their home system. The Compact sent a representative. His name was difficult for human vocal anatomy to reproduce cleanly, and the diplomatic mission translated it as Administrator Preth. He arrived at the Sol boundary in a single light courier, which was itself a signal. 1 ship, no escort, no weapons lock. Administrator Preth delivered the tier assignment in a brief formal session at the UN reception hall, presented 14 human diplomats with the paperwork for integration processing, and offered, as a gesture of compact goodwill. The message was the ship size. "You are not worth more than one of us. A drive core unit, a compact gravitational motivator of a generation that the Vourkai had phased out of active service 18 years prior." The gift was described in the accompanying technical brief as a demonstration of the capability differential, offered in the spirit of educational transparency. The humans accepted it. They shook Preth's hand, which he permitted, and filed the paperwork, and said they would need time to review the integration terms. Preth marked review acknowledged, 90-day window open in the file, and returned to Vourkai space. He noted in his trip report that the humans were polite, organized, and non-confrontational, and that their facility showed no weapons manufacturing activity of any scale. He rated the integration probability at 91%. The 14 ambassadors arrived at Vithara Station 2 years later to discuss the terms. Drevath Orn filed the last piece of footage at 14:07 on a Tuesday. Pre-Martial Species Management Case 70741H status. Resolved. He attached the broadcast timestamp, noted the 40 species relay confirmation, and closed the file. Then he opened his afternoon calendar, saw that his 1500 was a briefing on grain road optimization in Sector 4, and felt, without registering it consciously, the small administrative satisfaction of a cleared inbox. Earth said nothing. Not immediately, that was expected. The Compact's analysts had a standard 20-day window for initial response monitoring, but the 20 days passed without a single military signal leaving the Sol boundary. No fleet mobilization, no emergency broadcast. A localized memorial service was held on Earth's surface, non-broadcast, attended by a few thousand people. The 14 names were read aloud once. Then it ended. and the silence continued. At the 40-day mark, Orn's automated monitoring system flagged the absence of response as noteworthy. He reviewed the flag, noted that the humans had filed no formal objection with the Galactic Accord, and closed the flag as anticipated behavioral profile, species below Marshall threshold, non-response consistent with Tier 6 classification. He added a note, species appears to have accepted placement monitoring to continue at reduced interval. At the 1-year mark, he reduced frontier patrol density along the Seoul approach corridor by 30%. The reason was simple arithmetic. Patrol assets cost fuel, crew rotation cycles, and maintenance scheduling. A corridor with zero threat activity did not require the same resource allocation as an active frontier. The humans had demonstrated by 12 solid months of absolute silence that they were exactly what the file said they were, a low-aggression species that had processed a correction to their status and adjusted accordingly. Reallocating the patrol assets to the Kelvar border dispute, where 2 Tier 4 species were actively skirmishing over a mineral-rich moon, was the rational administrative choice. Orn signed the reallocation order on a Wednesday morning, between a logistics review and a lunch meeting. He did not think about the humans again for 18 months. The memo arrived on his desk during a budget cycle. It came from analyst Veth Soren, a junior intelligence officer assigned to the Civilian Activity Monitoring Division, the part of the Compact's intel apparatus that tracked non-military economic activity and administered and adjacent territories. Soren was 26 years into a career spent largely reading shipping manifests and salvage permit applications, and he had the patient, methodical temperament that work produces in people after enough years. The memo was 8 pages. Orn read the first paragraph. Anomalous civilian salvage permit activity, Seoul adjacent space, 18-month analysis, flagging for senior review. Standard civilian salvage permit volume for a Tier 6 species operating under integration track is estimated at 40 to 60 permits per quarter based on comparable species profile. Human civilian salvage permit applications over the past 18 months total 2,247, a rate approximately 40 times the expected baseline. Permit descriptions are consistent with industrial scrap recovery. Tonnage declarations are within individual permit limits. No single permit exceeds threshold for mandatory military review. However, aggregate tonnage across all active permits represents a volume of refined and semi-refined metal alloy sufficient to construct. Turned the page over and placed it face down on the corner of his desk. He had reviewed civilian salvage anomalies before. They were almost always the same thing. A species at the lower integration tiers discovered that scrap metal was tradable, organized an informal collective to collect and process it, and filed permits at whatever rate their administrative capacity allowed. The tonnage looked large because the permits were numerous. The permits were numerous because the humans, being organized and non-confrontational, had correctly identified the legal pathway for materials acquisition and were using it efficiently. The Compact's own doctrine was clear on this point. Uncoordinated civilian economic activity, regardless of volume, posed zero structural risk to administered security because it lacked the command hierarchy, weapons-grade processing infrastructure. There was nothing threatening about a civilian scrap collective and military-grade alloy specifications required to convert raw salvage into anything operationally significant. He set a reminder to review the remaining pages of the memo at the end of the budget cycle. On Earth, in a facility that appeared on no Compact registry, and was described on its civilian permits only as Reclamation Site 7 COSI, Industrial Salvage Processing, Non-Hazardous Materials. The reminder sat on his calendar for 11 days, then was automatically archived when the calendar system's housekeeping function cleared, resolved items. Soren's memo went into the archive with a status of low priority. Review pending, the memo stayed there. A woman named Lieutenant Commander Sarah N. Cosi was lying on her back under the primary spine of a vessel that had no name, no flag, and no registration number. She had been lying in approximately this position, or one very like it, for most of the past 4 years. The drive core unit that Administrator Preth had delivered, the obsolete gravitational motivator, the educational gift, sat at the center of the vessel's lower chassis, stripped to its basic components and reassembled 3 times over. She had learned to read the Compact's engineering notation by pulling apart the unit's documentation with a translation program and a lot of patience. Nkosi had spent 9 months on the first disassembly alone, mapping every tolerance and calibration marker before touching a single connection. And she had eventually understood not just what the drive did, but why it did it. The underlying principle by which a sufficiently precise gravitational gradient could be used to anchor a mass in space without physical contact. She understood it well enough to build something that worked differently. Not a drive, a lock. Above her, through the open chassis, the rough interior of the facility's ceiling was marked with 18 months of chalk measurements she hadn't bothered to erase. Numbers, angles, Load tolerances for the interdiction array she and 213 other people were assembling around the core unit, piece by piece, permit by permit, in absolute silence. She reached up and tapped the housing with one knuckle. It rang clean. Still good, she said to no one in particular. Across the facility, someone was welding, the smell of hot metal cut through the recycled air. She did not move for a moment, just lay there, listening to the work going on around her in the dark, feeling the vibration of it come up through the floor and into her back. 9 years, she thought. 9 years of Dreveth Orn not reading his mail. She hoped he kept that habit. Admiral Elias Vorn arrived at Reclamation Site 7 Kosi on a Thursday, in a salvage truck with a cracked side mirror, wearing civilian clothes that fit him the way civilian clothes always fit career military men, correctly sized and somehow wrong in every other way. He did not announce himself. He parked the truck at the loading bay, walked through the main floor past 3 welding stations and a row of alloy cutting frames without stopping, and found Nkosi still under the chassis where the night crew had left her 8 hours earlier. "You're early," she said without looking out. "I drove through the night." He crouched beside the opening. "How's the housing?" "Clean. The resonance is off by about 4% in the tertiary coupling. I've been deciding whether that matters." "Does it?" She slid out from under the chassis, sat up, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "No. The gradient at 4% deviation still exceeds the minimum threshold by a factor of 3. "I was just being fussy." Vorn looked at the vessel for the first time, really looked at it, the way he had looked at warships for 31 years, walking the thing with his eyes from bow to stern, reading the weight of it, the balance. It had no gun mounts, no launch tubes, no armor plating beyond structural minimum. It looked from a distance like a converted cargo hauler, which was exactly what its permit applications described it as. He looked at it for a long time. "It'll hold?" he said finally. "It'll hold," Nkosi said. "We tested the array in sections. Each node locks within tolerance. The question is never whether one node holds, it's whether all of them hold simultaneously at range against active drives." She paused. "We won't know that until we use it." "No," Vorn said. "We won't." He stood up, put his hands in his pockets, and looked at the ceiling the way people look at ceilings, when they are thinking about something they are not ready to say out loud. Then he said it anyway. "Nkosi, how many of the 214 have families they haven't told?" She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was the same flat register it always was, which meant she had already asked herself this question many times. "Most of them, right?" he said. He did not say anything else about it. He pulled a folding chair from against the wall, set it 3 meters from the ship's bow, and sat down in it with his arms on his knees, studying the vessel the way a man studies a problem he has already decided to solve. That was how he spent his first morning at the site, sitting in the chair, not speaking. While around him, 213 people went about the business of building something that did not officially exist. The drive core unit the Compact had sent as a gift occupied the lowest point of the ship's chassis, rebuilt around a skeleton of reclaimed alloy piping and what had once been the primary coil housing of a decommissioned civilian freight motivator. Nkosi had spent the first 2 years simply understanding what the Compact's engineers had designed, not to copy it, but to find the flaw in it. There was a flaw, there always was, in systems built by people who assumed no one else could understand them. The Vourkai gravitational drive worked by generating a precise, stable gradient that pushed against local space in a specific direction. The drive was elegant. It was also, Nkosi had eventually realized, completely dependent on its own active signal, a continuous low-frequency emission that the drive used to calibrate its gradient in real time. Without that signal, the drive couldn't maintain orientation. Without orientation, it couldn't push. But the signal could be used for something else. If you built an array of receiving nodes around a vessel's position, nodes tuned to the exact frequency of a Vourkai drive's calibration emission, you could use the drive's own signal to generate a counter-gradient, not a push. A hold. The drive would be, in effect, anchored by its own output. The harder it pushed, the tighter the hold. It was the gift turned inside out. Nkosi called it Project Flagless in the internal documentation, not because she was making a point, but because it was accurate. The vessel carried no flag, no registration, no military identifier of any kind, and the project's entire structure was built around that absence. No government sanction, no military chain of command. Civilian permits for civilian materials filed by civilian contractors, surfaced by civilian labor, operating on a civilian site, 214 civilians building a weapon system that targeted nothing a civilian would ever need to target. She had recruited them herself over 3 years. Engineers, mostly, former propulsion designers, materials specialists, a handful of gravitational physics researchers who had spent their careers doing exactly the kind of theoretical work that turns out under the right circumstances to have an application. She had not told them what the application was on the day she called them. She had told them what the compact had done. She had told them she had an idea. She had asked if they wanted to hear it. All 214 had said yes. 9 years of Saturdays and late evenings and entire weekends swallowed by the site. 9 years of explaining to families in terms that couldn't be explained. The cost was not in materials. The materials came in through the permits, slowly but steadily, within every threshold that would have triggered a mandatory review. The cost was in time. 9 years of watching people get quieter and more certain in the particular way people get quiet when they have decided something fundamental about what they are willing to do. 3 of the 214 had left in the 4th year. Not because they disagreed, Nkosi thought, but because they had children who were getting old enough to ask questions. She understood. She had not replaced them. The remaining 211 continued. Vorn spent his first week at the site in the folding chair. By the second week he had started walking the floor, asking the engineers questions in the unhurried way of a man who is learning something, not testing anyone. He had a background in orbital defense, warships, not gravitational physics, and he made no pretense of understanding the array's theoretical underpinning. What he understood was logistics, timing, and the geometry of an intercept. By the third week he had identified the problem. The patrol corridor, he told Nkosi, standing at the map she had pinned to the wall of the site office, a hand-drawn transit chart of the Vourkai frontier sectors, updated from publicly available shipping data. The reduction Orn ordered. What's the current gap? Nkosi had been tracking at 61 hours per rotation. Currently, the reduced patrol schedule creates a window in the 07 grid unpatrolled transit corridor, no active monitoring, no automatic flag on mass anomalies below a certain threshold. Below what threshold? Below military-grade drive signature. She looked at him steadily. We don't have a military-grade drive. Vorn looked at the map for a long time. How long does it take us to reach 07 from the sole boundary at the vessel's transit speed? 14 hours, and setup time once inside, 3 hours to deploy the array at full radius. The nodes travel folded. They extend on site. He did the arithmetic out loud. 14 in. 3 to deploy, 17 hours, against a 61-hour window. He stepped back from the map. That's not close. No, and Nkosi agreed. What makes you confident the window stays? Orn's budget cycle. The reallocation is tied to the Kelvar border action. As long as the Kelvar situation holds his attention, the corridor stays reduced. She paused. And the Kelvar situation has been ongoing for 6 years. Vorn nodded slowly. He reached out and tapped the 07 grid marker with one finger, then pulled his hand back. We wait for 72, he said. Not 61. I want the window at 72 hours minimum before we move. If the Kelvar situation ends and the patrols return to full density, we wait for the next reduction. That could be years. Yes, he said. If anything, in the past quarter, the volume had increased. Not dramatically, not in a way that tripped any single review threshold, but steadily, permit by permit, the aggregate tonnage growing in a direction that Soren found the more he looked at it. He sat back down in the folding chair. It could. In his office on Vithara Station. Veth Soren was writing a second memo. He had spent 6 months watching the permit data continue to accumulate, and the rate had not slowed. Genuinely difficult to explain through the scrap collective theory. Scrap collectives ran hot and then cooled off. They were opportunistic. They did not maintain a consistent, methodical acquisition rate across 7 years without a single quarter of reduced activity. He was not a materials engineer, but he had forwarded the breakdown to a contact in the Compact Civilian Materials Division who was, and her reply had taken 12 days to arrive and contained in its third paragraph. They did not, as a general rule, file permits for alloy grades that skewed consistently toward high tensile structural specifications. He had pulled the alloy grade data 3 weeks ago, and had been sitting with it since. A sentence that Soren had read 11 times. The alloy profile is consistent with structural grade construction for load-bearing chassis applications. It is not consistent with the processing requirements of standard civilian salvage operations. He wrote this in the second memo. He added a section on the patrol corridor reduction and noted, with the careful hedging of a man who has learned that certainty gets memos dismissed. He wrote the permit timeline. He wrote the aggregate tonnage figure, spelled out plainly in terms of what it could build if it were assembled rather than processed. He attached the alloy grade report. That the timing of the reduction and the acceleration of permit activity showed a correlation he could not yet explain but felt warranted attention. The memo was 14 pages. He routed it through standard intelligence channels, marked it elevated priority, and addressed it to Supreme Legate Ern's office. Orn's senior administrative aide received it on a Monday. She scanned the subject line, anomalous civilian salvage permit activity, Sol adjacent space, follow-up analysis, elevated priority. Noted that it was a follow-up to a memo already filed low priority and archived, and placed it in the Supreme Legate's physical review tray, which was the tray that received items of intermediate priority that would be reviewed when the budget cycle closed. On a Friday evening, 6 weeks after Vourn had settled into his folding chair, Nkosi walked the full length of the vessel, for the first time with all its systems connected, not running, just connected, every node in the interdiction array linked to the central core. The budget cycle was 3 weeks from closing. The memo sat in the tray, the whole network live and waiting. She walked it slowly, from the bow to the stern, running her hand along the outer casing of the array housing where it ran along the ship's lower flanks, feeling the faint warmth of the active electronics inside. The facility was quieter than usual. Most of the day crew had gone home. A few of the longer-serving engineers were still at their stations, not working, just present. Nkosi understood that. She had felt it herself periodically, over the past 3 years, the pull to simply be near the thing, to know it was real. She stopped at the midpoint and put her palm flat against the hull. The metal was cool and steady under her hand. It had no markings on it. No name, no registration, no flag. Just the slight vibration of the electronics, and the smell of recycled air and warm alloy, and the silence of the facility around her. She thought about Osei, the woman at the left end of the row. Nkosi got the confirmation from the monitoring system at 0314, pulled Vourn out of the cot he kept in the site office. She thought about her for a moment, and then she moved on, because the work was not finished. The 72-hour window opened on a Tuesday, and told him without preamble that the Kelvar action had entered a ceasefire negotiation phase, and Orn's patrol schedule showed a reduced rotation that had been live for 6 hours. Vourn sat on the edge of the cot for a moment, fully awake in the way of people who have been half expecting a specific piece of information for a long time. 66 hours remaining in the window. Nkosi said, "Time to departure? We can be underway in 90 minutes. He stood up, straightened his shirt, and looked at her. "Let's go," he said. The facility came alive without ceremony, no speeches, no flag raising, no moment of collective solemn recognition. People moved to their stations and completed their pre-departure checklists in the same methodical quiet that had characterized every day of the past 9 years. The vessel's systems powered on one by one, the array nodes running their final calibration sequence, the drive motivator, built around the Compact's own gifted core, cycling through its startup routine and coming live with a low, steady hum. At 0502, the nameless ship left Reclamation Site 7 Nkosi, through the facility's main transit lock, cleared the lunar approach corridor, and set course for the Sol boundary, without transmitting any identification signal. Not immediately, the vessel had been inside Vourkai space for 3 hours before the flag registered, because the grid sensitivity threshold had been calibrated for military-grade drive signatures, and the flagless drive was running at civilian transit output levels. On Vithara Station, no one was watching that particular patch of space. The Compact's automated mass detection grid flagged the anomaly at 0947, well below the line. What eventually tripped the system was not the drive but the mass, the raw physical tonnage of the vessel and its folded array nodes, moving through a sector that the patrol schedule marked as empty. The flag went to Orn's monitoring desk as a yellow level notification. Unregistered mass anomaly detected, Frontier Grid 07. No drive signature above civilian threshold, no IFF signal. Recommend intercept assessment. He read it in about 6 seconds, noted that the drive signature was sub-threshold and the mass reading was consistent with a large civilian cargo hauler. Orn was finishing breakfast when his aide placed the notification on his desk and made the assessment that a human civilian vessel, possibly a scrap hauler operating on one of their many permits, had drifted across the frontier boundary without filing the proper transit paperwork. It was a nuisance infraction. A standard intercept, a citation, a fine, and a course correction back to Sol space. He authorized the intercept and went back to his breakfast. The dispatch order went to Frontier Commander Varric Solon, who commanded the reduced patrol group assigned to Grid 07. Solon read the order, noted the civilian-grade mass profile, and dispatched 7 warships, more than was strictly necessary for a cargo hauler, but Solon was methodical, and the sector was low traffic, and he saw no reason to send fewer than a proper intercept formation. 7 ships, standard detachment, routine processing. He went back to his own desk and started on the morning's logistics reports. Inside the flagless vessel, Vourn was sitting in the chair he had brought from the site, the same folding chair from Reclamation Site 7 Nkosi. which Nkosi had watched him load into the cargo bay without comment when they departed. He was reading, of all things, a fuel consumption log. The kind of mundane operational document that senior officers review not because they need to, but because the habit of reading them is what keeps a command honest. Nkosi was at the systems console watching the grid. She had spent 9 years working alongside this man, and she had learned that his stillness was not distance. It was the way he thought, going very quiet inside himself while the situation developed around him. 7 ships, she said. I know, intercept formation. They'll drop out of transit in about 11 minutes. I know that too. He turned a page of the fuel log. Nkosi looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the console. The way a person goes quiet in a conversation when they are not waiting to speak but actually listening. The array is at full deployment, she said. Good. 7 contacts, moving fast, converging on their position in a spread pattern that was textbook intercept geometry. 2 ships ahead, 2 flanking, 3 behind, clean, professional. The kind of formation that said we have done this many times and expect no difficulty. The system reported all 7 vessels as present, intact and non-responsive to standard formation comms. Hull integrity showed nominal on all 7. Life support showed nominal, power output showed nominal. The ships were not damaged, not destroyed, not maneuvering. He walked to the larger monitoring display on his office wall, the one that showed the full frontier grid, and looked at the 7 stationary contacts in 07 for a long moment. His tea cooled behind him. His afternoon calendar had a meeting in 40 minutes. He pulled up the raw sensor data from the intercept zone, not the summarized feed, the raw numbers, and started reading it line by line, the way he had not read a raw sensor report in perhaps 12 years, because that was what analysts were for. He read it carefully. The output was being absorbed, not blocked, not jammed, but absorbed by a localized gravitational gradient that the sensors showed as originating not from any point in space, but from the vessels themselves, from their own drives. The ships were holding themselves in place. They were, in fact, quite simple, and Orn had been good at simple mathematics his entire career, which made the experience of reading them now considerably worse than if they had been complex. Page 3 showed the permit timeline. Page 4 showed the aggregate tonnage. Page 5 showed the alloy grade breakdown, and beside it, Soren's attached note from the materials contact, the one that said consistent with structural grade construction for load-bearing chassis applications. Orn read that sentence and was quiet for a moment. One large vessel with an array of specialized nodes. Orn set the calculation pad on the desk and looked at it. His monitoring panel chimed. A new signal had appeared in grid 07, not from the 7 immobilized ships, but from the flagless vessel itself. It was addressed with precise routing to Orn's own personal terminal interface, bypassing the station array entirely, reaching his desk the way a letter reaches a desk, directly, privately, without asking for permission. He looked at the signal notification for a moment. Anger, maybe, or satisfaction, or the kind of deliberate menace that people adopt when they have earned the right to it. He had dealt with species who treated moments of advantage as an occasion for theater. Admiral Elias Vorn looked like a man reading a maintenance log. We've had 9 years to think about the right thing to say to you at this moment, and I find that what I want to say is quite short. He leaned forward slightly in the folding chair. We didn't fight back then. Supreme Legate. We got to work. Orn did not speak. No crew casualties. No destruction of any kind. Bounce back at them by an array built from a discarded diplomatic gift and 9 years of civilian scrap permits. Orn picked up the calculation pad. He put it down again. How many of these can you deploy? He said. 1 was enough, Vorn said. The silence on the channel lasted 4 seconds. In that silence, a second monitoring alert appeared on Ern's panel. Sullen's command ship had sent a crew status report through the emergency beacon system, the only communication that still worked. It will also carry the drive data from the intercept, the raw sensor readings showing what the array did to your fleet. I suggest you share that data with your admiralty. Another pause. 30 days, Supreme Legate. After that, I won't call you first. The channel closed. He was a small man with the careful posture of someone who had spent a career being ignored in rooms, and he stood in the doorway of the Supreme Legate's office with the expression of a person who is not sure whether they are in trouble. Sit down, Orn said. Soren sat. Orn placed the memo on the desk between them. He put his hand on it briefly, then took it away. You were right, he said. The words came out flat, not confessional, not generous, just accurate, the way he had always spoken, because it was the only register he knew. Orn sat alone in his office and began drafting the correction. He had it finished by the end of the day. Not because it was difficult to write, it wasn't once he started. It was the simplest administrative document he had produced in 30 years. One page, the date, and then 14 names listed in the order they had been standing in the row, which he was able to determine from the execution footage metadata because the guard had filmed the proceedings for the official record. He read the names over once when he was done. Vaisant. Ose. She did not know what he was reading. She did not ask. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. She turned back to the console. The array nodes were already cycling through their power-down sequence, one by one the way they had been designed to clean, orderly, no fuss. They were filed in intelligence archives and strategic planning documents and, in at least 3 cases, in the private correspondence of defense ministers who used different language than their official files, language that was shorter and more direct. And that said, its central argument fit in 4 sentences which she placed at the opening of the introduction. The Vourkai Compact read the silence correctly. They identified it as patience. They mistook patience for defeat. The distinction, it turned out, was the entire war. He sat with his hands on the desk and the memo face up, and the window behind him showing a coast that did not know his name, and after a while he got up and went about the rest of the day. The desk did not rule the frontier anymore. Nothing else needed to be said about that.